The Interstellar Tribunal Station, New Geneva, hung in the void like a monument to bureaucratic excess. All gleaming chrome and unnecessary architectural flourishes that screamed, "Look how civilized we are." The irony wasn't lost on Commander Cassandra Fletcher as she sat in the defendant's chair, surrounded by creatures who thought humanity's greatest achievement was learning to use cutlery. The courtroom itself was a masterpiece of interstellar pomposity. Floating holographic displays cast ethereal blue light across tiered seating arranged in a perfect circle, because apparently nothing said justice, quite like forcing everyone to stare at each other. The judge's bench curved in an imposing arc above the proceedings, occupied by representatives from the galaxy's most enlightened species, a term that, in Cass's experience, usually meant they'd forgotten how to fight for anything worth keeping. Judge Arbitrator Velnara, a crane-like being whose species had evolved past the need for individual names, how wonderfully progressive, tapped her ceremonial gavel with all the authority of someone who'd never held a weapon heavier than a law book. Her voice carried the musical quality typical of the Altarian race, which would have been pleasant if it weren't currently being used to question Cass's basic humanity. "Commander Fletcher," Velnara intoned, her words floating through the courtroom's translation matrix with crystalline precision. "You stand accused of 17 violations of the Galactic Warfare Convention, 8 counts of excessive force deployment, and 1 charge of conduct unbecoming a sentient officer. How do you plead?" Ambassador Thorne, and wasn't that just perfect, a human name for someone who seemed determined to prove that humanity deserved a cage, rose from the prosecution's table with the kind of theatrical flourish that suggested he'd practiced this moment in front of a mirror. His perfectly tailored diplomatic robes rustled with each calculated movement, a sound that reminded Cass of leaves being crushed underfoot. "Your Honors," Thorne began, his voice carrying just enough gravitas to make it clear he took himself very seriously indeed. "What we have before us today is not merely a case of military misconduct. This is about the very soul of interstellar civilization. The defendant's actions during the Battle of Kepler Station represent everything wrong with humanity's approach to conflict resolution. Where our enlightened allies seek harmony through understanding, humans bring chaos through violence." Cass couldn't help herself. A smile played at the corners of her mouth, not the kind that suggested amusement, but the sort that made smart people start looking for exits. "If I were a war criminal," she said, her voice cutting through Thorne's rhetoric like a plasma torch through tissue paper, "you'd already be dead." The courtroom erupted. Gasps echoed from the gallery where diplomats and observers sat in their assigned seats, arranged by species hierarchy, because nothing said equality quite like making sure everyone knew exactly where they ranked. Several of the more delicate representatives actually clutched their translation devices, as if Cass's words might somehow infect them with barbarism. Velnara's gavel came down with enough force to crack the sound barrier. "Commander Fletcher, you will restrain yourself or be held in contempt." "Oh, I'm already being held in contempt," Cass replied, settling back in her chair with the easy confidence of someone who'd stared down worse things than a room full of bureaucrats. "I'm just returning the favor." Counselor Henry Rothen, her court-appointed defense attorney, leaned over with the pained expression of someone watching a shuttle crash in slow motion. Henry belonged to a species that looked like someone had crossed a teddy bear with a philosophy professor. All soft fur and worried eyes. His people, the Benthari, were renowned throughout the galaxy for their diplomatic skills and their ability to find common ground between opposing viewpoints, which made him either the perfect choice to defend a human or the worst possible one. "Cass," he whispered, his voice carrying the gentle reproach of a disappointed parent. "Perhaps we could save the dramatic declarations for after we've heard the evidence?" "The evidence," Ambassador Thorne continued, seemingly unfazed by the interruption, "will show that Commander Fletcher's actions at Kepler Station violated every principle of civilized warfare. She employed psychological torture, used enemy equipment in unauthorized configurations, and showed a complete disregard for the established rules of engagement." Judge Gorthak, whose reptilian features suggested his species had evolved from something that ate things like thorn for breakfast, leaned forward with interest. "These are serious charges, Ambassador. What specific actions are we discussing?" Thorne activated a holographic display that filled the center of the courtroom with a three-dimensional recreation of Kepler Station. The mining platform hung in space like a metallic flower, its industrial arms extending toward the asteroid field it had been built to harvest. It looked peaceful, productive, the kind of place where families lived and worked and built futures. "Kepler Station," Thorne announced, "home to 12,000 civilians, scientists, miners, their families, a peaceful research and extraction facility that had never seen military action until the day Commander Fletcher arrived." The hologram shifted, showing sleek warships materializing around the station like predators surrounding wounded prey. The ships bore the angular design philosophy of the Korvaxi Empire, all sharp edges and aggressive lines that suggested their builders had never met a curve they didn't want to weaponize. "The Korvaxi Empire's Third Fleet," Thorne continued, "conducting what they claimed was a routine inspection. Under interstellar law, they had the right to verify that Kepler Station wasn't violating mining treaties in the disputed Outer Rim territories." Cass watched the display with the detached interest of someone reviewing old home movies. She remembered every detail of that day, the way the morning shift had been rotating when the Korvaxi ships dropped out of hyperspace, the smell of recycled air in the station's command center, the taste of coffee that had gone cold while she'd studied tactical displays and calculated odds that would have made a gambling man weep. "What the records will show," Thorne said, his voice rising with the practiced cadence of someone who'd given this speech before, "is that Commander Fletcher, acting without authorization from Galactic Defense Command, turned a diplomatic inspection into a massacre." The hologram shifted again, showing weapons fire erupting between the human vessels and the Korvaxi fleet. Explosions blossomed in the vacuum like deadly flowers, and Cass could see the exact moment when everything had gone sideways, when diplomacy had failed, and the only language left was violence. Judge Aylin, whose energy-being physiology made her look like a humanoid aurora, spoke in harmonics that the translation system rendered as a sound like wind chimes in a thunderstorm. "Ambassador Thorne, are you suggesting that Commander Fletcher initiated hostilities?" "I'm suggesting," Thorne replied, "that she escalated a tense but manageable situation into a war crime. The evidence will show that she used tactics specifically prohibited by the Galactic Warfare Convention: psychological manipulation, weaponization of enemy communications, and deliberate targeting of command structures to maximize confusion and terror." Cass felt Henry tense beside her. Her defense attorney was good people, probably the only being in this room who actually cared whether justice got served alongside the politics. But Henry's people solved problems through discussion and compromise. They'd never faced an enemy that viewed negotiation as a sign of weakness and mercy as an invitation to push harder. "The prosecution will demonstrate," Thorne continued, warming to his theme, "that Commander Fletcher's actions resulted in the complete destruction of the Korvaxi Third Fleet. Not captured, destroyed. Not disabled, obliterated. She turned what should have been a minor border incident into a slaughter that violated every principle of proportionate response. The holographic display showed the aftermath: debris fields where proud warships had been, emergency beacons crying out in the darkness, the scattered remains of a fleet that had entered the system with overwhelming force and left as scrap metal and regrets. "Your honors," Thorne concluded, "humanity stands at a crossroads. They can join the galactic community as civilized beings, bound by the same rules that have kept peace between our species for centuries. Or they can remain the savage. Primitives their actions at Kepler Station suggest they truly are. The choice is yours." He sat down with the satisfied air of someone who'd just delivered a closing argument, apparently forgetting that trials usually involved hearing from both sides before rendering judgment. Velnara turned her attention to the defense table, where Henry was frantically shuffling through data tablets, while Cass sat with the serene expression of someone watching a particularly entertaining comedy show. "Counselor Rothan," the judge said, "does the defense wish to make an opening statement?" Henry stood, his small frame dwarfed by the courtroom's imposing architecture. When he spoke, his voice carried the gentle authority of someone accustomed to being underestimated. "Your honors, the defense intends to show that Commander Fletcher's actions at Kepler Station were not only justified under human military doctrine, but represented the only possible response to an unprecedented threat. We will demonstrate that the Korvaxi Third Fleet was not conducting a routine inspection, but rather implementing the opening phase of an invasion protocol that would have resulted in the enslavement or death of every civilian on that station." A murmur ran through the gallery, the kind of sound crowds made when someone said something interesting enough to make them forget their predetermined opinions for a few seconds. "Furthermore," Henry continued, "we will show that Commander Fletcher's tactical decisions, while unconventional by galactic standards, were precisely calibrated to achieve maximum strategic effect with minimum loss of life. The prosecution speaks of massacre, but the evidence will reveal that Commander Fletcher saved 12,000 civilian lives while eliminating a threat that had already conquered 6 other systems using identical tactics." Thorne shot to his feet like a spring-loaded accusation. "Objection! The defense is introducing evidence not yet presented to this tribunal." "Sustained," Velnara ruled. "Counselor Rothan, please limit your opening remarks to what you intend to prove, not the evidence itself." Henry nodded respectfully. "Of course, Your Honor. The defense simply wishes to establish that there are 2 sides to every story, and that the human approach to warfare, while perhaps unfamiliar to this tribunal, operates from principles of protection rather than aggression." As Henry sat down, Cass caught his eye and gave him a small nod of approval. Her lawyer was learning, slowly but surely, that sometimes the best defense was a good offense. But what none of them knew, not Henry, not Thorne, not the pompous tribunal members sitting in judgment of humanity's newest poster child for interstellar incidents, was that Cass had been planning this moment for months. She'd known the trial was coming before the charges were even filed, had anticipated every argument Thorne would make, every piece of evidence he'd present, every theatrical gesture, designed to paint humanity as the galaxy's newest threat to civilized order. Because Cass Fletcher hadn't survived 15 years of military service by being reactive. She'd learned long ago that the best way to win a war was to choose your battlefield, and sometimes that battlefield was a courtroom full of species who thought they understood what humans were capable of. They were about to get an education, and the first lesson was about to begin. Ambassador Thorne rose from his seat with the practiced grace of someone who'd spent years perfecting the art of looking important. His first witness materialized in the holographic testimony chamber, a shimmering blue construct that allowed beings from across the galaxy to testify without the inconvenience of actually traveling anywhere. How wonderfully efficient. The prosecution calls Captain Jorik Mendus of the Korvaxi Third Fleet, Thorne announced, his voice carrying the weight of righteous indignation. The figure that appeared in the chamber was impressive in the way that apex predators were impressive. All sharp angles, and barely contained violence wrapped in a military uniform that screamed authority. Captain Mendus belonged to a species that looked like someone had decided regular humanoids needed more teeth and fewer qualms about using them. His testimony came through the translation matrix with the crackling authority of static electricity. "I commanded the cruiser inevitable victory," Mendus began, his words carrying the clipped precision of military protocol. "We were conducting a standard compliance inspection of the mining facility when the human vessels opened fire without provocation." Cass watched this performance with the detached interest of someone who'd seen better acting in children's theater productions. She could practically hear the coaching behind Mendus's testimony, the careful word choices designed to paint the Korvaxi as innocent victims of human aggression. "Captain Mendus," Thorne continued, "can you describe the nature of this standard compliance inspection?" Certainly. The facility was operating in disputed space, mining resources that might have violated territorial agreements. We were authorized to board and conduct a full audit of their operations. What Mendus didn't mention, and what Cass knew he'd been instructed not to mention, was that full audit, in Korvaxi military parlance, meant stripping a facility of anything valuable before deciding whether the inhabitants were worth keeping as slaves or simply spacing to save on transport costs. The holographic display activated again, showing the tactical situation as it had developed around Kepler Station. The Korvaxi ships moved in formation like pack hunters, surrounding their prey with the patient efficiency of predators who'd done this dance many times before. "As you can see," Thorne said, gesturing toward the display, "the Korvaxi fleet maintained proper inspection distances. They made no aggressive, if information could be destroyed, then the universe wasn't deterministic, wasn't predictable, wasn't the clockwork mechanism that Newton had envisioned." A note of curiosity. "Counselor Rothan, do you have documentation to support these claims?" Henry activated his own holographic display, showing a data stream that made even Cass blink in surprise. Her lawyer had been busy during the preliminary hearings, apparently. The display showed fleet movement records, facility reports, and what looked suspiciously like intercepted military communications. The defense submits Intelligence Report Delta 99, compiled by Earth Confederation Naval Intelligence over a period of 18 months. This report documents a clear pattern of Korvaxi military operations disguised as administrative inspections. Judge Aylin's energy-being physiology flickered with what might have been interest or annoyance. The translation protocols weren't quite sophisticated enough to handle emotional nuance in species that existed as sentient plasma. "This is fascinating, Counselor. But how does it relate to Commander Fletcher's actions?" "Because, Your Honor, Commander Fletcher had access to this intelligence report. She knew exactly what a Korvaxi compliance inspection actually meant." The courtroom erupted again, but this time the sound was different. Instead of shocked gasps, there were murmurs of calculation as various species representatives began reassessing what they'd just heard. Henry wasn't finished. "Captain Mendus, during your standard inspection of Kepler Station, did your fleet deploy boarding parties?" "We prepared to deploy boarding parties, yes." "How many?" "Standard complement, perhaps 2,000 troops. 2,000 armed soldiers to inspect a mining facility's paperwork?" Mendus's expression suggested he was beginning to regret accepting this assignment. We like to be thorough. And these troops were equipped with standard boarding gear. Henry activated another display, showing detailed scans of Korvaxi military equipment. Standard boarding gear that includes neural inhibitors, stasis restraints, and processing equipment typically used for what purpose, Captain? I'm not familiar with the technical specifications of all our equipment. Equipment used for processing civilian populations for relocation to labor camps. The silence that followed was the kind that made smart people start looking for ways to change the subject. Even Ambassador Thorne seemed to realize that his star witness was rapidly becoming a liability. But Cass knew Henry was just getting started. Her lawyer had spent weeks preparing for this moment, and the Benthari approach to problem-solving meant he'd considered every possible angle. Captain Mendus, you testified that Commander Fletcher opened fire without provocation. Are you familiar with Earth Confederation military doctrine regarding the protection of civilian populations? I am not. Article 12 of the Earth Military Code states that any commander who allows civilian populations under their protection to be subjected to hostile boarding actions will face court-martial for dereliction of duty. Commander Fletcher didn't have the option of allowing your inspection to proceed. Her own military law required her to resist. Thorne was on his feet again. Objection! Human military law is irrelevant to interstellar warfare conventions. On the contrary, Henry replied smoothly. Article 4 of the Interstellar Warfare Convention specifically states that military commanders are bound by the legal requirements of their own species. Commander Fletcher was legally obligated to protect Kepler Station's civilians. Velnara's gavel came down with the sound of cosmic justice trying to maintain order. The objection is overruled. Continue, Counselor Rothan. Henry turned back to his witness with the patient expression of someone who'd saved the best for last. Captain Mendus, I have one final question. During the battle that followed, what happened to your fleet's civilian evacuation protocols? I don't understand the question. Your ships were equipped with evacuation systems designed to rescue civilian populations from damaged facilities, were they not? Standard emergency equipment, yes. And yet, when Kepler Station's outer hull was breached during the fighting, not one Korvaxi vessel moved to assist in civilian evacuation. Instead, your fleet maintained attack formation and continued firing on human rescue shuttles. Can you explain this tactical decision? The pause this time stretched long enough to develop its own weather patterns. Captain Mendus looked like someone who'd just realized he'd walked into a trap that had been months in the making. We were engaged in active combat operations. So engaged that you couldn't spare a single ship to rescue the civilians you'd claimed to be protecting? Combat situations are fluid. Command decisions must be made quickly. Indeed they must, Henry agreed. Which brings us to the real question, Captain Mendus. If the Korvaxi Third Fleet was truly conducting a peaceful inspection, why were your ships configured for planetary assault rather than administrative oversight? The holographic display shifted again, showing detailed scans of the Korvaxi vessels. Even Cass had to admit she was impressed. Henry had somehow obtained intelligence-grade sensor data that revealed weapons configurations, troop deployments, and equipment loadouts that painted a very different picture than Thorne's version of events. I'm not qualified to discuss technical specifications, Mendus said, but his voice carried the hollow ring of someone who knew the game was up. No further questions, Henry said, settling back into his chair with the satisfied expression of someone who'd just disassembled a supposedly unassailable position using nothing but facts and logic. As Captain Mendus faded from the holographic chamber, Cass caught sight of something that made her smile. the first genuine expression of amusement she'd shown since the trial began. Ambassador Thorne was frantically consulting with his assistants, their hushed conversation carrying the desperate undertones of people trying to figure out how their carefully orchestrated show trial had suddenly become an actual legal proceeding. But the real surprise came when Thorne called his next witness. The prosecution calls Dr. Patricia Vance, Chief Medical Officer of Kepler Station. The woman who materialized in the testimony chamber was someone Cass recognized, a competent, no-nonsense physician who'd served on Kepler Station for 3 years and had never shown any particular love for military personnel. If Thorne thought he could use her testimony to paint Cass as a trigger-happy warmonger, he was about to learn why it was dangerous to call witnesses you hadn't properly prepared. Dr. Vance's testimony started exactly as Thorne had planned. She described the terror of civilians trapped aboard a space station under military attack, the chaos of evacuation procedures, the horror of watching weapons fire light up the darkness outside their viewports. But then Henry began his cross-examination, and everything changed. Dr. Vance, during the 3 hours between the Korvaxi fleet's arrival and the beginning of combat operations, did you have occasion to monitor their communications traffic? Yes. Standard medical protocol requires monitoring emergency frequencies in case evacuation becomes necessary. And what did you hear on those frequencies? Dr. Vance's expression shifted to something harder, more angular. Discussions of processing quotas. Debate about which civilians would be useful for labor assignments and which were expendable. The courtroom fell silent again, but this time the silence carried weight, the kind of quiet that suggested everyone was finally beginning to understand what had really happened at Kepler Station. Dr. Vance, Henry continued, in your medical opinion, what would have happened to Kepler Station's civilian population if Commander Fletcher had permitted the Korvaxi inspection to proceed? Her answer came without hesitation, delivered with the clinical precision of someone who'd spent years dealing with hard truths. Based on the communications we intercepted, approximately 30% would have been selected for forced labor relocation. The remainder would have been terminated to reduce transport costs. And there it was, the truth that Ambassador Thorne had hoped would never surface, delivered by his own witness in language so clear that even the most politically motivated tribunal member couldn't pretend to misunderstand. Cass felt a familiar warmth in her chest, the satisfaction that came from watching a plan unfold exactly as intended. Because while everyone in this courtroom thought they were judging her actions at Kepler Station, she was actually 3 moves ahead, gathering intelligence for a game that none of them realized had already begun. The real war wasn't being fought in space. It was being fought right here, in this room, with words and evidence and the kind of strategic thinking that her opponents had never learned to recognize until it was too late. Part 3. The Human Way of War. When Cassandra Fletcher took the witness stand, the entire courtroom seemed to shift, like gravity itself had decided to pay attention. She moved with the fluid economy of someone who'd learned that wasted motion could mean the difference between going home and going into a body bag. The holographic testimony chamber materialized around her, but somehow she made it look like the technology was there to serve her, not the other way around. State your name and rank for the record, Henry said, though everyone in the room already knew exactly who she was. Commander Cassandra Fletcher, Earth Confederation Navy. Serial number Hotel Echo 99 Alpha Charlie 6. Her voice carried the kind of quiet authority that made people straighten their spines without realizing why. Commander Fletcher, can you tell the tribunal about your military background? Cass settled back in the witness chair with the casual confidence of someone who'd testified before scarier audiences than this collection of bureaucrats and politicians. 15 years, active duty. Started as a communications specialist. Worked my way up through tactical and strategic command. Specialty training in asymmetrical warfare, psychological operations, and what we politely call unconventional problem-solving. Judge Gorthak's reptilian features registered what might have been curiosity or hunger. Sometimes the distinction was academic, with species that had evolved from apex predators. Commander, what exactly does unconventional problem-solving entail? The smile that crossed Cass's face was the kind that made smart people start looking for exits. It means we win fights we're not supposed to win, Your Honor. Humans have a talent for turning disadvantages into advantages. We're remarkably good at making our enemies' strengths work against them. Can you elaborate? Gladly. You see, most species approach warfare like a chess match, careful, methodical, following established rules and conventions. Humans approach warfare like a bar fight. We'll use whatever's handy, hit you where you don't expect it, and keep coming until you stop moving. Ambassador Thorne looked like he'd swallowed something unpleasant. Your Honor, is the defendant actually bragging about human brutality? I'm explaining human adaptability, Cass corrected. At Kepler Station, the Korvaxi brought 43 ships against my task force of 8 vessels. Classic military thinking says we should have surrendered or withdrawn. Human military thinking says we should have asked ourselves what the Korvaxi expected us to do and then done something completely different. Henry activated a tactical display showing the battle as it had actually unfolded, not the sanitized version Thorne had presented, but the full engagement with every twist and maneuver highlighted in glorious detail. Walk us through your tactical decisions, Commander. Certainly. First, I analyzed Korvaxi military doctrine. They're pack hunters, excellent at coordinating overwhelming force against inferior opponents. But pack hunters have weaknesses. They expect their prey to run or submit. They don't expect their prey to bite back. The display showed human ships moving in patterns that seemed random until you understood the underlying strategy. They weren't trying to match the Korvaxi ship for ship. They were creating chaos. I started by jamming their command frequencies and replacing their tactical communications with audio from Earth's history archives, specifically recordings from human conflicts: Gettysburg, Stalingrad, the Alamo. Judge Elan's energy-being physiology flickered, with what the translation protocols rendered as confusion. Why would historical recordings be tactically relevant? Because psychological warfare isn't about what you broadcast, Your Honor. It's about what your enemy starts thinking about after they hear it. The Korvaxi had studied human military capabilities, but they'd never bothered to study human military psychology. They knew we were outnumbered. They knew we were outgunned. What they didn't know was that humans have a long history of turning impossible odds into moral victories. The tactical display shifted, showing Korvaxi formations beginning to loosen as confusion spread through their ranks. Ships that should have maintained perfect coordination started making individual decisions instead of following fleet protocols. While they were trying to figure out why we were broadcasting ancient history lessons, I deployed our real weapon, something no other species had ever thought to use in space combat, which was improvisation. I had my engineers modify our mining charges, standard equipment for any operation in asteroid fields, and launched them at Korvaxi ships using cargo delivery systems. Their defensive screens were calibrated for military ordnance, not repurposed industrial equipment traveling at unconventional velocities. Thorne shot to his feet again. "Your Honor, the defendant is describing the use of improvised explosive devices against legitimate military vessels." "I'm describing the use of available resources against an invasion force," Cass replied calmly. "The Korvaxi brought military-grade weapons to what they thought would be a civilian suppression operation. I brought human ingenuity to what they discovered was a war." The display showed the battle's turning point, Korvaxi ships beginning to withdraw as their carefully planned assault devolved into something they'd never trained for. A conflict where their opponents refused to follow conventional rules and kept introducing variables that weren't supposed to exist. "Commander Fletcher," Henry continued, "the prosecution has suggested that your tactics constituted war crimes. How do you respond?" "I respond by pointing out that every civilian on Kepler Station went home to their families that night. The same cannot be said for the other 42 facilities the Korvaxi had inspected using identical protocols." For the first time since the trial began, the courtroom was completely silent. Not the charged silence of political theater or the stunned quiet of shocking revelations, but the deep, thoughtful silence of beings who were finally beginning to understand what they were really judging. "Your Honor," Cass said, addressing the tribunal directly, "I've spent 15 years learning how to protect people who can't protect themselves. I've studied every military doctrine, every tactical manual, every strategic framework developed by every species in this galaxy. And you know what I learned?" She paused, letting the question hang in the air like a challenge. "I learned that most species fight wars to achieve political objectives. Humans fight wars to end them. We don't seek conquest or domination or territorial expansion. We seek the kind of victory that makes our enemies decide they'd rather negotiate than fight." The tactical display faded, leaving only Cass in the witness chamber, a single human woman facing down the combined judgment of interstellar civilization. The Korvaxi Third Fleet came to Kepler Station expecting easy prey. They found apex predators instead. And now they know something that every military strategist in this galaxy should probably write down. Her smile returned, sharp enough to cut diamond. "If you're going to pick a fight with humanity, you'd better make sure you win it on the first try. Because we learn fast, we adapt faster, and we never forget." Judge Arbitrator Velnara raised her ceremonial gavel, the crystalline instrument catching the chamber's ambient lighting like a prism of impending judgment. The courtroom held its collective breath, thousands of beings across dozens of species waiting to see whether humanity would be welcomed into galactic civilization or branded as barbarians unfit for polite society. "The tribunal will now deliberate," Velnara began, but her words were cut short by an alarm that sent ice through the veins of every being present. The station's emergency klaxons erupted in a symphony of mechanical panic, their wailing cry accompanied by flashing crimson lights that bathed the courtroom in the color of fresh blood. The holographic displays flickered and shifted, tactical readouts replacing legal proceedings as New Geneva's defense grid came online with the desperate urgency of a system under attack. "What in the 9 hells?" Judge Gorthax snarled, his reptilian features twisting into something that suggested his ancestors had eaten things much larger than their current prey. The main display materialized ships emerging from hyperspace, sleek, angular vessels bearing the aggressive design philosophy that everyone in the courtroom had just finished studying in excruciating detail. The Korvaxi Empire had come calling, and they'd brought friends. "Well," Cass said, her voice cutting through the chaos with the calm precision of someone who'd been expecting exactly this development. That's convenient timing. Ambassador Thorne spun toward her, his diplomatic composure cracking like cheap paint. You knew about this. Ambassador, Cass replied, settling back in the witness chair with the satisfied expression of someone watching a masterfully choreographed performance. I've been counting on it. The tactical display showed the attacking fleet in horrifying detail. Not just the remnants of the Third Fleet that had survived Kepler Station, but a full battle group comprising over 60 vessels. Enough firepower to reduce New Geneva to component atoms and scatter the debris across 3 star systems. But what made the display truly terrifying wasn't the ships themselves. It was their formation. The classic Korvaxi pack hunting pattern, designed to overwhelm defenders through coordinated assault and psychological pressure. The same formation they'd used at Kepler Station and 42 other facilities before that. "Attention, New Geneva," came a transmission that crackled through the chamber's speakers with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "This is General Korux Prime of the Korvaxi Empire. You are harboring war criminals and enemies of legitimate galactic order. Surrender them immediately, or face the consequences." Judge Aylin's energy-being physiology flickered with what the translation protocols couldn't quite render. Some combination of terror and indignation that manifested as chromatic chaos. "They're attacking a neutral tribunal station. This violates every principle of interstellar law." "Principles," Cass observed, "are wonderful things to have right up until someone shows up with enough guns to ignore them." She stood, moving with the fluid grace of someone shifting from defendant to commander, without missing a beat. "Your Honors, I believe we're about to receive a practical demonstration of why human military doctrine exists in the first place." The station shuddered as the first Korvaxi weapons found their mark, and Cass could hear the distinctive whine of failing shield generators struggling to absorb energies they'd never been designed to handle. New Geneva was a diplomatic facility, not a fortress. Its defenses were meant to discourage pirates and smugglers, not repel military assault. "Security Chief to all sections," came an announcement that carried the controlled panic of someone realizing their worst-case scenarios had been optimistic. "We are under attack by unknown vessels. All civilian personnel to emergency shelters. All military personnel to battle stations." Cass activated her personal communicator with the casual efficiency of someone who'd been preparing for this moment for months. "Fletcher to Earth Confederation Task Force. Execute Protocol 77 Alpha." Henry looked at her with the confused expression of someone watching magic tricks without understanding the mechanics. "Cass, what's Protocol 77 Alpha?" "Something I had Admiral William Kane position in this system 3 days ago," she replied, her smile carrying the sharp satisfaction of a chess player announcing checkmate in 6 moves. "You see, Henry, the wonderful thing about being accused of war crimes is that it gives you an excellent excuse to study your enemy's tactical doctrine in extraordinary detail." The main display shifted again, showing new contacts emerging from hyperspace, ships bearing the distinctive configuration of Earth Confederation vessels. Not just a few escorts or patrol craft, but a full battle fleet comprising every advanced warship humanity had managed to build in the past 5 years. "Admiral Kane to New Geneva," came a transmission that carried the granite authority of someone who'd spent 30 years learning how to project calm competence in the middle of chaos. "Earth Confederation Navy is responding to distress signals. Korvaxi vessels, you are in violation of interstellar law. Withdraw immediately or face defensive action." General Korux Prime's response crackled with the kind of arrogance that suggested he'd never met a problem he couldn't solve by applying more violence. "Human fleet, you are outnumbered 2 to 1. Withdraw or be destroyed alongside the criminals you protect. General, came Admiral Kane's reply, and even through the static of combat communications, Cass could hear the smile in his voice. You might want to recalculate those odds. What happened next was exactly what Cass had been planning for months. A practical demonstration of human military doctrine that would settle the question of war crimes once and for all. The Earth Confederation fleet didn't charge into battle with the kind of heroic stupidity that made for good stories and bad tactics. Instead, they did something that no other species had ever thought to attempt. They turned the Korvaxi's own advantages against them. Human ships moved in patterns that seemed random until you understood the underlying psychology. They weren't trying to match the Korvaxi formation. They were creating exactly the kind of chaos that pack hunters couldn't adapt to, turning a coordinated assault into a series of individual engagements where human improvisation and adaptability could shine. Your Honors, Cass said, addressing the tribunal while weapons fire painted the stars in brilliant patterns of destruction. You wanted to know whether my actions at Kepler Station constituted war crimes. Allow me to demonstrate the difference between human military efficiency and actual war crimes. The battle unfolded with the kind of surgical precision that made it clear this wasn't humanity's first encounter with Korvaxi tactics. Ships that should have been overwhelmed by superior numbers instead turned their opponents' coordination into confusion, their discipline into chaos. But what made the engagement truly educational wasn't the military maneuvering. It was what happened when Korvaxi ships were disabled rather than destroyed. Human vessels moved immediately to rescue survivors, even in the middle of active combat. Medical shuttles launched from Earth ships to assist damaged Korvaxi vessels, while communications specialists worked to establish surrender protocols. You see, Your Honors, Cass continued, this is what war crimes actually look like when you prioritize military objectives over civilian safety, when you treat surrender as weakness rather than wisdom, when you view enemy combatants as resources to be exploited rather than sentient beings deserving basic consideration. The battle reached its conclusion with the kind of mathematical inevitability that suggested it had been choreographed rather than fought. The surviving Korvaxi vessels limped away from New Geneva, their invasion fleet reduced to a handful of damaged ships, and a very expensive lesson in the dangers of underestimating human tactical thinking. Judge Arbitrator Velnara looked around the courtroom with the shell-shocked expression of someone whose carefully ordered universe had just been reorganized by forces beyond her comprehension. Commander Fletcher, how long have you been planning this? Since the moment I received notification of these proceedings, Your Honor. You see, the real war crime would have been allowing the Korvaxi to continue their expansion using tribunals like this one to eliminate opposition. Sometimes the best defense is a good prosecution. She turned to address the full tribunal, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd just proven every point she'd ever needed to make. Your Honors, humanity requests formal membership in the Interstellar Defense Alliance. We believe our tactical expertise might prove useful in maintaining galactic peace. The silence that followed was different from any that had preceded it. Not the quiet of shock or political calculation, but the thoughtful pause of beings who'd just witnessed something that changed their fundamental understanding of how the universe worked. Commander Fletcher, Velnara said finally, this tribunal finds you not guilty of all charges. Furthermore, we formally request that Earth Confederation consider establishing a military advisory council to assist other species in developing more effective defensive strategies. Cass's smile could have lit up a small solar system. Your Honor, I'd be delighted to discuss the finer points of unconventional problem-solving with anyone interested in learning. As the courtroom began to empty, Henry approached with the bewildered expression of someone who'd just watched his client turn a war crimes trial into a job interview. "Cass, how did you know the Korvaxi would attack during the trial?" "Henry," she replied, "when you've spent 15 years studying your enemies, you learn to predict their mistakes. The Korvaxi couldn't resist the opportunity to eliminate their most effective opponent, while she was conveniently restrained by legal proceedings." She paused, looking out at the stars where Earth Confederation ships were already beginning rescue operations for damaged Korvaxi vessels. "Besides," she added, "I told you at the beginning, if I were a war criminal, you'd already be dead. The fact that everyone in this room is still breathing should have been your first clue that maybe, just maybe, humanity knows the difference between necessary force and gratuitous violence." And with that, Commander Cassandra Fletcher walked out of the courtroom that had tried to judge her, leaving behind a galaxy that was finally beginning to understand why picking a fight with humanity was the kind of mistake you only made once.